University and has had a distinguished career as head of the Ellen G. White Estate Research Office in Brazil and, I think, rector of UNASPE?
No, of the Latin American...
Of the Latin American Theological Seminary, yes, of the Latin American Theological Seminary.
Campus.
So, and he is published widely on Adventist history and especially the development of Adventist theology. And he has been a wonderful addition, if I may say so, to the Ellen G. White Estate since arriving last year. And his wife also works for the GC Archives in our digitization program. So we're very happy to have both speakers. We'll begin with Galina Stele. Her paper is The Seventh-day Adventist Church in the Russian Empire, the USSR and the Euro-Asia Division, A Church Growth History. And Alberto will be speaking to us on the subject Adventist History in Brazil, Research Strategies.
As you can see, that my title has some addition to that David just announced. So I've the Seventh-day Adventist Church in the Russian Empire, USSR and Eurasia Division, a church growth history, amazing story of God's providence. And I hope very much that I will not be accused of naive providentialism, because now I visited the lecture of Dr. Miller and heard that there is such a term. But actually, when I study church history, I always amazed how God can move people and separate persons, I could say, to do His will, and how He can walk in whole countries and whole states for His cause. I would like to start with this quotation. This is quotation from Lepsa, Heinrich Lepsa. He was one of the, actually he was the first president of all Union of Russian Federation. Walk and don't get tired. The God's walk is as a river. Nobody can stop it. As you probably know, the Adventist message came to the Russian Empire at the end of the 19th century. At that time, the territory of Russian Empire was really huge. And you can see the map here, the additions that Russian state added during several centuries, from 1613 till 1914. And so you can kind of guess that 1914 it's light brown, so it's just small additions. But if you exclude it, it was actually the territory, all the rest was the territory for the end of the 19th century, including Finland, Poland, all Eastern Europe and Northern Asia. So to this territory, the Adventist message had to come. And it was really a challenge because the Orthodox Church dominated the scene of religious and social life. And not only the Orthodox Church was there, but also the Roman Catholics, also Buddhists, Muslims, and shamanists, almost all, of course, Jews also were there. All religions almost were there, actually. But the Orthodox Church dominated the scene and prohibited to evangelize the Orthodox people. So how to bring the Adventist message to this great territory, to great nation, not only of Russian people, because more than 130 different ethnic and groups and nationalities lived over there at that time. So probably you know from church history that the first person who considered as a founder is Ludwig Conradi. He came in 1886 to Russian Empire, and he organized, and he organized the first Russian congregation. It was in July by old calendar, and by new calendar it would be in August in 1886 in Verdibulat, Crimea. And if you don't know where it is, so this is Peninsula, now it is Ukraine, and you can see Simferopol, and I marked this red. So near Simferopol, approximately 44 miles away, it was this place that was named as Verdibulat, where the first congregation was formed. 19 people were added to Adventist church at that time. Not all of them were baptized because most of them were made members by profession of faith, because they came out of different Protestant denominations, because they were by origin Russian Germans. Although several of them, about 2 or maybe even a little bit more, were Russians, and they were baptized, and that's why these people, Ludwig Conradi, and also his translator, Gerhard Perk, who translated him during this visit into Russian language, they were accused by the Russian priest and put in prison. And they spent in prison about 40 days, and only because of the help of the American ambassador from Petersburg, who decided to help the American, who came to evangelize Russians, so they were released from the prison. Interestingly enough, when they were in the prison, they wrote 10 commandments on the wall of the prison. And then people, some other Adventists later, they also were put in this prison. So it was kind of very historical place, this prison. Gerhard Perk, who was the first translator to Adventist message, also a very interesting person because he is considered to be one of the first Adventists converted by Adventist publications sent from USA. Probably you read a lot about him because it's everywhere published, since he was one of the first converts by Adventist American publications. But maybe not. But actually, about 20 years later after that, in 1907, he visited General Conference session, and he shared his story with the whole, audience of the General Session delegates. And he told his story of conversion, that his neighbor, probably Mennonite, he received a tract, Adventist tract from America, probably at the end of the 70s. And so he received this tract, read the tract, and he considered it heresy. And because he understood that the content does not connect with his belief, it's heresy, but it was very interesting heresy. So he didn't want to put the tract into the garbage, but he hid the tract. And 3 years later, he kept it for 3 years in secret. And sometimes he read it over and over. And then he decided to share with this friend, Gerhard Perk. And he said to him, I have very interesting publication. I don't know where it is from, but this is such a strange and powerful heresy that once you read it, you will be converted immediately. So Gerhard Perk became very interested, and he said, give me to read. And he said, no, I cannot, because then I will be kind of, instrument to your apostasy. So Gerhard Perk pleaded with him because he became so curious. He wanted to read it because he now knew that for 3 years he kept in secret place this tract. So he received the tract under secret, promised not to share with anyone. He went to the Haymall and he read it all through. And when he shared the story with the General Conference in 1907, he said, immediately when I read it, I was convinced that this is the truth. And this was Adventist publication. And he copied the address, and he sent his letter with the request to send more. That's how he became the first Adventist. It was 1883. Before, so you see the date where the first congregation was formed. It was 1886, right? So it was before that, 3 years before. And he became like a secret Adventist. And sometime after that, he began to work for the Bible Society. It was a Bible Society, Protestant Bible Society in Russia. He sold Bibles. And he had very interesting experience with God. He began to pray earnestly about the truth. He began to read Bible. And it was kind of revealed to him by God that he needed to follow this tract and this truth that he read in the tract. And he began to keep Sabbath separately from his family. So this is his story. Interestingly enough, that when the first congregation was formed, they not only formed the congregation, they kind of organized a structure. An elder and a deacon was also elected. This is the picture of the first elder of the first Adventist congregation. He is in the middle, Gottfried Tetz. He later became a very prominent leader of the Adventist church, known in many church sources, Russian sources, I would say. And so he was the first elder. And you can recognize the name, it's also of German origin. But if you look at the different sources, you could recognize that although the first congregation was formed in July or beginning of August of 1886, there were many other followers of Adventist truth already. Conradi just came to this place and formed here, and in his articles and letters he said that I regret very much that I cannot visit all other scattered believers, followers of Adventist truth, who are already in Russia, because otherwise we would form more congregations. And it is known that approximately 30 members officially the church had in her list by the end of the 1886, but about 80 people who had accepted the truth already but were not accepted as members because nobody came to baptize them. Although we kind of heard the story of the first congregation, I would like to say that this congregation did not appear out of nothing. And I would like to suggest for you to look from this angle that it was God's providence. God was preparing the soil for more than 100 years before that. And I decided to put in a diagram the sequence of different events and known facts that preceded this formation of the first congregation. You see 1886 over there, first baptism, first congregation, Conradi and Laubhan. Laubhan actually was another evangelist that was sent from Europe, who came in May 1886 and baptized the first Russian person, Babienko. He baptized him in May before Conradi came to Berdibola, but he baptized him in different region, in Volga region. So let's see, that in 1763, it's more than 100 years before that, Catherine the Great, she issued the manifest that invited Germans to come from Europe to help to develop Russian Empire. And you can see this figure that about 3 million Germans came from Europe and settled in Russian Empire. And they were promised that they would be allowed to keep their religion, will be free from taxations, and will be free from the service in the Tsarist army. So they came, and they were free to be Lutherans, Mennonites, Baptists, whatever religion they had. And actually the Orthodox Church could not send them, exile them to Siberia or put in prison if they changed their faith, because they were not subject to the Orthodox Church. So God prepared the way that a large crowd, came to Russia who were already Protestant. So in 1813, you see that Bible Society was formed in Russian Empire with the help of the Tsar, who was a reformer, Alexander. And already in 1823, the Bible was translated in 41 languages of the people that were living in Russian Empire, including some people from Asia with Muslim background. One language was from there. And the Bible was translated in the Church Slavic language that could be understood by intelligentsia and by educated people. But the language was used during the church services, so common people maybe not understand everything, but educated people could, and people began to read Bible because it was published. And it is also a very interesting, amazing story about how Bible was published in Russia. So, with the 1840s, we know from some interesting sources that about 20 families began to keep Sabbath and wait for the second coming of Jesus. Probably because they began to read Bible. Russians, not Germans, Russians. And they were exiled and put to prison and sent to Siberia. And why we know that? Because one person could not handle this persecution and pressure, and he renounced his faith, and he was sent back home, and he found a daughter of one family who was sent with him to Siberia. And he found this daughter, and he told her the story that we were about 10 families. All children were taken away from us. we were sent to Siberia, and at such and such point, about near one such and such city, 10 other families joined us who were sent to Siberia to prison, and they were about the same place. They were keeping the Sabbath, and they were waiting for the second coming of Jesus. So this lady later met one of the Union presidents of Russia and told the story. And then he told the story to another leader, and that leader of this church met this lady himself. That's why we know that approximately in the middle of 40s, we had already people who kind of were first Adventists, but they did not know that the church exists like Seventh-day Adventist Church. The same story was with one Russian officer, very remarkable story, who spent about 30 years in prisons and exiles because of his faith. He was keeping 10 commandments, he was keeping the Sabbath, he taught his children to do this, and he was waiting for the second coming of Jesus. So he went through very, very difficult situations and hardships and persecutions and torture even. And when he was released and came back to Petersburg, he began to publish even a journal trying to share the truth. So you see it is middle of the 19th century. Then you see that in 1876, Bible was translated in modern Russian language at that time. More people began to read Bible. And we know about one person, Babienko, who became, I have a picture of him here. So this is one of the first Russian converts because of the reading of the Bible. And he began to keep the Sabbath somewhere in 1870s. So this is a very interesting story about this person, because he helped the Orthodox priest to read Bible during the services, and he became so interested, he asked them to take the Bible home to read with his family. He began reading the Bible, inviting his friends and neighbors, and so he created a circle and even formed a society of Bible followers, and even went to Kiev to see the governor, so that they could allow them to build a church of new belief, so that they could keep the Sabbath in this church. Of course, he never returned back from Kiev. He was arrested right there and sent to Stavropol, and there he got Bible again, and he formed again a circle of his friends. So he was baptized in May, as I told you that one person was baptized in May by Laubhan in 1886. And so it was very interesting and long story. But you can see also that somewhere in 1870s, German people, many families immigrated to Canada, immigrated to South America, immigrated to North America. And many of them found Adventist truth. They began sending the tracts to their relatives in Russian Empire, how the Pirk we just heard received the tract. And so many of people began receiving Russian journals from their families from the United States. And you see that in 80s, group of believers, they already were there, and they began to write letters to join General Conference asking for a minister to come and to baptize them, and that's why Conrad came. So you see, it's like a long chain of different events and situations and circumstances that got prepared. I know that time is running fast, and I have a lot to say. I just would like to say that the first period of the church history, I would like to call the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Russian Empire. And it would be, from my point, till October Revolution. The second period will be this Adventist Church in the USSR from 1917 till 1990, and then the church in post-Soviet time. And I would like to single out especially the period of public evangelism from 1991 till 1995, and then Seventh-day Adventist Church in postmodern time till now, I guess. Or probably I would name the period that we are now with Eurasia division differently. I would name it beyond the Soviet borders, because now they have Afghanistan added to them, and it was never in their territory during the Soviet time. So this first period, when the Seventh-day Adventist Church was in Russian Empire, was a very interesting period. And we can see that in 1897, about 10 years later, 23 congregations were already there, more than 800 members, and among them more than 100 Russians, Ukrainian, Lithuanians, not only Russian Germans. We can also see that the church began to develop a strategy to reach Russian population. And they also wanted to publish Sabbath school lessons in Russian language, and that's why they decided to gather money for the journal Olive Tree, so that they can publish and spread it among Russian members. And this is the picture of the editorial team, office of editorial team, and in the center you can see Lepsak, whose quotation I read just several minutes ago. He was editor of many journals and of this one as well. This is editorial team. And if you can see the map, probably you cannot, but I can read the one line with the big letters. It is heathens, how many heathens are in the world. So they were very, kind of goal-oriented. It was a big help for the church when the state issued Edict of Tolerance in 1905, where the church was allowed to propagate Adventist message among Russians as well. Because before, all the ministers who were serving the Russian population or Russian congregations, they were put to prison, to exiled, and were under persecution. This was Bert Hirsch, the first president of the Russian Union Conference, organized in 1907 as a separate union in Russia. This you can see Ellen G. White Thoughts from Mount of Blessings, and it was published in Petrograd, it's Petersburg, in 1915. You see the dates of the new regions that were entered by Adventist Church during that time. Of course, at the time they were not countries. Now we consider them countries, but at the time they were parts of Russian Empire. If you would like to see the growth, numerical growth, not all are by the end of the year, and they are from different sources, but you can see steady growth during these years. So second period was very interesting because it was a mixture of good and evil together. And you know that many territories went away from the USSR after the Russian Empire was no in existence. And it was like 12 years of relative freedom first, but civil war, chaos, and poverty epidemics and famine was there. So this is a map, and yellow and green constitute the territory of the USSR. So very interesting that at that point Adventist Church, Adventist leaders became very conscientious about that new members don't know Adventist history, they don't know global Adventist history, they don't know their local Adventist history. And they voted on one of the meetings that one of the leaders should write a book on Adventist history. And this man, Lepsak, Heinrich Lepsak, was chosen to write a book of Adventist history, and he began writing it. And he wrote the book during 1980 in Kiev, where was civil war, and literally the people were dying on the streets, and for several days nobody could take them away because it was war going on the street, it was civil war, and bullets were going to and from. And it was one day very dangerous situation because one bullet came into their house and exactly above the table where he was writing. And just several minutes before that, he stand and he went away for a break. He was working on this book, So it was a clear miracle that the bullet came, otherwise it would be in his head. So he wrote a book in German language. Although he cited and referred to the Adventist sources, Adventist Review, SDA yearbooks from General Conference, because he used them as a reference. And he sent the publication to Hamburg, where it should be published, and it was never published. And during the Second World War, actually it was destroyed, and several copies were preserved in Russia, and only about 100 years later, the church discovered the manuscripts and some typewritten written copies and pieces of them, and combined them together and translated it and published it when we celebrated 120 years Adventist Church in Russia. We published his book. So these are the long list of people who died in their booths. You can see that I found this saying, I don't know, maybe there is a better one, but actually they died during their work because of this hard situation during this decades. You see that President of West Siberian Mission died, President of Eastern Russian Union died from typhus, Pastor, the brother of Perk, who became also a minister, died. Several other names, Bible workers and pastors died. You see President of Southeastern Union died from typhus. Treasurer in Siberian Union died. And many other people died. And also Otto Reinke, maybe you know his name, he was an American. He could leave the country after the revolution, but he decided to stay to help the war. And he was a president of Eastern Russian Union, and he died in 1921 in period of famine. And he was succeeded by Heinrich Klepsak. So these are the countries that were into during this decade. Kazakhstan, Belarus. You can see that new members were added, and more than 29 nationalities were in 1929. This is office of Southeastern Union Conference in 1927. You can see the lady who with a typewriter typing the protocols, and a treasurer and a secretary. And this man, who was a president of this union, he died later in Stalin's camps. This is a picture of the Second Constituency meeting in Caucasus, Tbilisi, Georgia. You can see how many people are there. Membership grows. And then, this is great controversy translated in Russian language. This is Russian church in Harbin in China. Actually, there was a Russian mission. And a person about whom I told you, who was the first Russian convert, because he read the Bible to a Russian priest, his son became a pastor over there and led the work in China for Russians. You heard probably a lot of stories about Stalin's repressions. 3,000 or more Adventist members were subjected to repression, about 500 returned. Out of 179 Adventist pastors were arrested, and only 4 returned. There are different figures, but approximately the same statistics. So Heinrich Klepsak, who wrote this book, and who was at that time the president of all Union Council of SDR Russian, was arrested in 1934. You can see his picture. This is from KGB archives. You can see bruises on his face because he was severely beaten. And you can see his number, his L. This is the first letter of his last name. So he died there 4 years later. Nobody knows that he died from because he was sick and weak, or because he was shocked. Nobody knows. But when he was arrested on this day, he told these words to people who were in his apartment, including his successor. Walk and don't get tired. The God's work is as a river, nobody can stop it. And he wrote this document where he kind of passed his responsibilities to this person. He was his assistant, Pastor Grigoriev. And this was the last official document kind of signed by this former president who died in under Stalin's repression. And he succeeded him as the president of all Russian Union. So you can see here at the bottom the number of membership in big cities of the Soviet Union at that time in the 50s, after, before and after Stalin's death. The church, nevertheless, although the church had such a great loss, it still had many people in the congregation. Riga 900, Tallinn 600, Moscow 500, Kiev 300, Lvov over 100, Rostov-on-Don over 100. This is kind of all Union Council with Brother Grigoriev and his members of the council. The person who is from your left, Matsanov, became influential leader, and he succeeded after the death of Grigoriev. He succeeded him, And his wife actually became like a story writer, story about repressions and hardship. She gathered the story from the people who came from prison camps, and she wrote the stories and she hid the stories. They were hidden for 40 years. Every time they moved, she took with them, and she kept them in secret places for many years. And only when Gorbachev came to power, she published the book. And that's why we know the names of many martyrs who died during Stalin repression. So I think I need to finish, right?
Yes.
So I just probably finish with that. 1960, it was very terrible year for the Adventist Church, because official organization of the Adventist Church was dissolved, and SD archive was confiscated by KGB. And after that, for several decades, the church didn't have leadership. And actually because of that, the church split it, and we had two groups with two leaders. And later, in 1981, Brother Elder Neil Wilson came and he helped unite the church. And official president became Michael Kulakov. And later he became the first president of the division of the Soviet Union. Okay. I did not finish, but I think that we covered a lot.
Really finish my paper. And besides, I think that Arthur Stelle definitely would appreciate more the previous presentation than this one. What I decided to do is to share some of our research strategies in Brazil. And not so much the history of the church. That would be almost an endless presentation also. And let's go directly to the point, and then I will explain a few points. George Knight says that after the book is published, you see the mistakes. So forgive me. I just put a working draft because there are a few things that should be added, and time did not allow. I mentioned at the beginning a little bit about the country. The latest statistics or search from the World Bank shows that Brazil has close to 200 million inhabitants, and is a mosaic really of different cultures, immigrants. Few people know that we have the largest Japanese colony in the world. And so, of many different, you have tastes almost of everything. It's like a boiling pot. And the church started, the first baptism was in 1895. And the church really started with the German immigrants. And you will see that many of the church leaders over there have German names, like in my case, and many others. And only later on is that the Portuguese-speaking population was reached in a movement from the south to the north and from east to west. And it's remarkable, this is something that should be studied a little bit more, the church growth in the country. And for instance, they say, well, Brazil used to be the country that has the largest number of Seventh-day Adventists. But since they decided to clean the church records, it went somewhat down, and India is, at least is considered...
Not only until they clean their books.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that somebody said if we would be serious, probably...
I think Brazil, I would guess, has the highest percentage population of Adventists in the world.
And financially also it's doing well. The Brazil Publishing House, from the latest report, is selling more than, at least somebody told me, I didn't double check, almost more than all the other publishing houses together. And but at the same time, the church growth in the country is a challenge, is a blessing for those who are really into church growth. But from a historical perspective, it's a challenge for the church identity, how to keep it with a new generation. And so, or the new generations that come into the church. So, feeling that that was a challenge of identity, we try to be more intentional in trying to rescue our historical heritage. And the first major point, I am highlighting here 7 major steps. The first one is the establishment of a Brazilian Adventist Heritage Center. And the South American Division took a vote in October 1986 to recognize the Brazilian Ellen G. White Research Center. Was not official at that time, was just a study center, as the Heritage Center. And then from that day on, we started some projects. I asked some of the students to write their papers for the class of SDA Church History about their local churches, so that, because sometimes you have a student from a specific church and that guy will not, and maybe nobody else will come from the same place. So if we miss that chance, that would be like a lot, we would be losing a lot through this. But then we decided also to send out letters and forms to the 3,600 churches and companies that in 1986 we had in Brazil. But unfortunately, very few answered, replied, and sent it. But sometimes we have to learn from our mistakes, what to do. And we discovered something. People from the south were more eager to respond than people from the north and northeast. And this has some kind of sociological explanation to it. But because we received more from specific regions and not from the whole country, we realized that something more intentional should be done in order to cover the whole country. And that's when we started with the idea of establishing or starting a Brazilian SDA encyclopedia. And so we did. We published it in the Revista Adventista, the entries, the list of entries that we had, and also the philosophy of the encyclopedia, and so we started working with that project. But later on, it was an alphabetical sequence. Then we came to the idea, and I was looking the Encyclopedia of World Soccer of 1994, because it was the World Cup in this country here, and I saw that the encyclopedia was organized by sections. You had one on the nations, the other one on the players, and so on. And that drew my attention to the idea of having a topical encyclopedia. And AZ, within each of these 6 different sections that you have listed here, and I am not reading it because otherwise we will go over time, so I am just pointing out to a few points. But finally, in 1997, I am on page 3, the middle of the page, we realized that we had not enough sources and resources to work in with an encyclopedia like this. And so we decided to move towards another strategy. And this was to start symposiums of SDA church history in different areas. And so if you go through the list, you will see the first was the history of the campus, the university campus itself, then the canvassing work in the country, then the third one would be the history of education, and then of the church organization, and of youth ministry, and medical missionary work and communication, and finally even music. And each one of those started, the structure was to have a worldwide perspective and then coming close and specifically dealing what took place in the country. And some of those were published, and then I left and the project stopped and was not continued, but that provided us with enough information to for going back to the encyclopedia project. And so in 2005, the encyclopedia was again started, but with a different approach. We didn't have at that time enough resources, as I mentioned, and people to write it. So if we would decide to finish it, probably the millennium would start and we will still be there working with the project to try to finish it for publication. And then somebody, I don't know, was able to access our internet, through the internet, the files of the encyclopedia, that's my guessing, and stole them and displayed in another web page. And I knew that person. I spoke to the guy later on and he just stopped his project and so. But that gave us an idea of starting an electronic or an online encyclopedia. So what we did, we developed our outline or the sections of the encyclopedia we put there, and so whatever article was done was added to it. So whatever was already finished was at least released for people to access. And then here, we don't have time to access here, but it's a very nice encyclopedia. And that one has become a model for some other South American countries to follow it. Then, with this research, and it's interesting one point, when we started the symposiums, we had always theology students from my class doing bibliographical research. And so they had to go through the Revista Adventista, that was the main source of information in those days. And so they prepared some biographies as a starting research for the presenters.
Bibliography.
Bibliographies. And this material called our attention to the possibility of having the whole Revista Adventista online. And so after those bibliographies were done, we started typing the Revista Adventista, till a friend came and said, well, but the GC Archives has it online, and they have the Déjà Vu program that can even help to do research in scanned materials. And so we stopped the project. This is not the only reason, there were some other ones, because what happened is the students were eager in typing it. Some 40 years they were able to cover, but we didn't have a staff to revise whatever was typed. So we did not succeed with it. And then we discovered, I contacted Bert Halowiak, and he then provided us with some resources. And even I double-checked some specialized companies that professionals that would do professional scanning in São Paulo, and it was very cheap. It was not so expensive. But when we knocked at the Brazil Publishing House door to get approval from them, they said, no, we own the magazine, and then we will take care of it. It took a while, but finally they succeeded, and in, I guess it's 2008, they finally released it, and this is the web page in the first paragraph of page 6. There are many books that have been published, especially biographies and a few dissertations also. But I think that the major work has been done by Floyd Greenleaf. First, his 1992, the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Latin America and the Caribbean, 2 volumes. And then, at the division, we contacted him and asked if he would be willing to accept the challenge of pulling out whatever had to do with South America and to update it. And that he did, and so in May 2011, the book was published in English, Portuguese, and Spanish. The English edition is for free distribution, so I have with me a copy of it, and if some of you would like to have one, I have in my office a few left, and you just wait a second after we are done and I can bring to whoever would like to have it. As you know, Floyd Greenleaf is retired, but he worked for many years at Southern Adventist University. And then, you know, sometimes history is so far away. It can be basically from a foreign country, like the United States or Europe, and so on, but nothing so much closer to where we are. And in this sense, I started in the year 2000 to build a network of Ellen G. White mini centers in Brazil, and it spread to some other countries also. And the purpose of those mini centers is to study the Bible, although they are called Ellen White mini centers, but to study the Bible, the writings of Ellen White, and local church history. Because if we don't have something close to where we are, probably many of the resources will be lost. And so they are digging there at the front line or at the grassroots, trying to bring. And last month, we had already 165 active mini centers just in Brazil, not counting the other ones. 2 Ellen G. White Research Centers and 1 Ellen G. White Study Center in the north. And basically, they help to promote the writings of Ellen White, but as you know, compilations are not made at that level. And also, usually documents are produced in different places, but not at. So what is left for them is to promote Ellen White, of course the Bible also, and to do original research in SDA church history. So concluding, I have just a very short paragraph. Some strategies used by the Brazilian Adventist Heritage Center can be duplicated in other parts of the world. Other ones perhaps not, but regardless of the direction one goes, I personally believe that we have to be as intentionally as possible and to use different strategies and projects to reach our goals. By doing so, we are helping the church to keep alive its wonderful historical heritage of faith. So you will see that what we try to do, and I am saying not that it's perfect, is what we had at our hands, is to come up with as many strategies as possible, not overloading the thing, and to involve as many people as possible, because usually if we want to do everything by ourselves, it will not succeed. So in summary, the whole thing is not so much of just providing fish, but teaching people how to fish.
Questions or comments? Dr. Phillips.
There are a number of Brazilian Adventist churches in North America. Have you looked into the possibility of including them in your history of Brazilian Adventism, or you just dealing with those in Brazil?
This is something that to be considered. I don't know how many Brazilian churches are today. A few years ago, somebody told me that there will be some 60. And that's something, I started in Jerusalem, and then Judea. And so, let me just finish. What we did is we established a couple of months ago Ellen White Mini Center in the Brazilian church where I am a member close by here, to provide a model, because if I don't do it close to my own place, how can I try to convince other ones? And so this is the starting point. And this is not just a Brazilian project, this is a worldwide one. And there are other countries, but the idea is to get as many people as, as many churches as possible involved.
Thank you.
I was wondering, from Galina's presentation, what sort of resources and materials exist during the period when the church was more or less underground? And the story of this split and the reunification sounds very, very interesting, but I'm wondering what kinds of records and resources we have to tell the story.
Actually, Ellen G. White writings, they were translated, and in typewritten copies, members had them. Of course, we did not have, or our parents did not have regular Sabbath school lessons at that time, because all connection with the worldwide church was lost and prohibited actually. But I think that the pioneers built a good foundation, and Bibles and Ellen G. White writings were the
Yeah, actually my question was slightly different. It has
Okay.
to do with what sort of records do we have
Okay.
of the church business and operations, and how can we reconstruct the story of that period? Are there materials
Yeah,
to draw on?
We don't have many sources, but some people did the same, like this lady who kept the stories of the people who were in prisons, came back or were released. So the structure was in the underground church almost the same, although in some places it was like local, functioning like local field structure. So people have the leadership, usually presidents and secretaries and treasurers, and they kept the records and they hid the records. So, and then they pass them to others, So some sources were lost, some sources are left. And recently when Moscow Church was doing renovation in their building, actually in one of the rooms they discovered the pictures of the decades ago were hidden somewhere in the room, and they did not know that this album existed, but they found it. So there was something like that, and so church tried to keep some records. Although, as Ravina knows, that during the decade from 30s till 50s and even till 81, there was no official record sent to General Conference. And if you look through the Seventh-day Adventist yearbooks, there will be like short sentence repeated many years that there are estimates based on the information that we got, So there were estimates for several decades. And only from 1981, the statistics began to be gathered regularly from all the regions and unions and fields and sent to General Conference. But before that, it was kept locally. People did the best they could.
Alberto, you want to?
Yeah, while Galina was speaking, it just came to my mind. You know that the first Seventh-day Adventists in Brazil were immigrants. And the official church did not reach them at the beginning. And some of those, and the very first ones, were Russian Germans who were baptized already there and immigrated to the state of Santa Catarina. And then later on, and they built a church with the Russian Orthodox, and on Saturdays they met, or they together, and on Sundays the Russian Orthodox at their meetings. So what I think that the greatest challenge that we have is if I try to study the history of a country in isolation, I will not be able to go so far. If we could start, as we talked a little some time ago, a global history, a global project, then we can trace this kind of people, yes, and people who immigrated from one place to another one. And Daniel Heinz tried to do a little bit, and he contacted me about people from Germany that went over there, and the official church did not preach them at the
We
beginning.
come back to the point in the previous panel, Adventism is a history of diasporas, perhaps.
May I add
Galina, yes.
something? So it of course depends from, what kind of period you are talking about. If we are talking before October Revolution and before Stalin's repressions, the church was pretty good on the records because they were part of the European field, and they sent records over there. And even now in Friedensau in archives, we have documents about that part of the history with the records of Russian church. And also, they not only sent over there, they sent to review, Adventist Review. And many facts and stories actually we know because we're now going through the Adventist Review and we're reading the stories, and even some of the stories are reports. And also, some, that at that time we did not have computers, so it was typewriters, and usually we did several copies. So all Sabbath school lessons and Ellen G. White books were sometimes 8, 10 copies. So the same they did with the protocols. So even if one copy was lost or taken by the government, several copies somewhere were hidden or left over. And even in the book that Lepsa published, there are several lists with the records about the constituency meetings, number of people present, decisions, and so on. So kind of got protected that at least some part of the history was preserved. And I know that Arthur will add more because he was the president of the division for a decade.
Dr. Stella,
But
would
you
you
were
like
the first lady, weren't you?
Dr. Stella, would you care to comment?
I just wanted to say that the story with history of the Russian Church is similar to the situation in the Palestine. We have not discovered in Palestine anywhere a library yet, although we have discovered it from Egypt, from Babylon, but not from Palestine. And so we are still looking forward to discover it. The same is true about the Russian history. We know that archives were kept, records were kept, and we know at least that when the KGB closed the church in the 60s, early 60s, they have arrested and seized the archive, and it was a very big, sizable archive, and it is still in the KGB files. There was one very short window when of the period of evangelism when Yeltsin was in power,
Yes.
that for few months the files were open, and from Friedensau, Dr. Heinz had the chance, he visited the archive. He had to pay big amount of money for every copy he was making. So he did what he could. But then immediately they closed the archive. So we are still looking for the day when the archive will be open and we will get a lot of information.
So the history, when the KGB opens its archives, the history of the Russian Church will be written authoritatively. So, any final questions? All right, well, let's thank our two presenters again. Oh, one last.
I was gonna say that if you see above Galina's head,
Yes,
Heinrich Lepsa.
you can see him on our wall of Adventist historians. We have him there.
Seems to be the-
And actually, the picture that I showed with his face bruised is from KGB archives that Daniel Heinz did when he was looking through the papers, and he found his personal,
Right.
file.
File.
File, and he made a copy.
Let's thank our two presenters. Well, thank you very much for coming. Thank you for staying. Let's stand and let's close with a brief word of prayer.